Have you ever played Mario Kart before, or kind of watched your kids or your grandkids play it? You know, you sit in a small little cart like that and you drive around a circle with 8 other people driving against you that you have to beat. And, you know, I've never been really good at video games like that. So usually I was last pretty much from the beginning and I just tried to catch up. And sometimes you make a little bit of progress and you finally pass by somebody else and you're all happy and you celebrate until you see the person that's up in front get out one of those stupid banana peels and just throw it onto the road where you're driving on. And you, of course, drive over the banana peel and you spin round and round and round and you lose all of your progress. Let's be honest, for those of you who have played it before, there's nothing that's quite as infuriating as driving over a banana peel like that, is there? I think there are a lot of banana peel moments. So those are always the moments where I feel like, people are making it unnecessarily difficult for me to do what I set out to do. And I feel like there are a lot of moments in life where things are just unnecessarily difficult. I remember I just moved here to England about 3.5 months ago, and moving is hard. That's just necessarily difficult, right? You have to carry all the boxes, and it's emotionally draining. And so at the 3rd day when I lived here, my dad came over and he helped us a little bit. And at the end of an exhausting day, we wanted to go to a pub and just have a nourishing, vitamin-filled fish and chips meal to carry us to the next day again. And so we went to this pub and we sat down expecting for somebody to come and take our order. And we were hungry and exhausted and we just sat there and we sat there and we sat there and nobody seemed to show up and take our order. So eventually I went up to somebody from the staff team and I asked them if somebody can come and we can order. And they just told me, oh, we have an app for that. You can just download our app and then order on the app. Great. Only problem is I still have a German phone with a German phone contract, and my dad's phone is dead and mine doesn't really connect to whatever. And so I'm trying to download the app, doesn't really work. So I decide to eventually use the Wi-Fi network of the pub, and I try to connect to the Wi-Fi network, but it's one of those forms where I just have to fill out, everything about myself in order to get their Wi-Fi. And so they asked me for my postcode, for example. And I was just new in England, right? So I don't know my postcode yet. So I'm trying to scroll through my emails, but I don't have internet, so I can't really scroll. So I'm just getting angrier and angrier because I just want my fish and chips, right? And so I sat there, and it just felt like, banana peel over banana peel. And it was just like, why are you making it so difficult for me? It shouldn't be this difficult to order fish and chips, right? There are difficult situations that you experience in your life as well, aren't there, where you just think it shouldn't be this hard. Why are they making it unnecessarily difficult? I think church is oftentimes the same in our experience of church, and you might have asked that same question. I've grown up in a church and I'm deeply grateful for them and for what they were like, because they had a big youth work. I went on youth camps every year, 2 or 3, and in one of those youth camps, I also became a Christian, and it was really exciting. And in all of the next youth camps, I became a Christian again. What felt like, and so always when I came home from the youth camps, I was thinking, hey, I want to live a Christian life now, where I learn to follow Jesus and just follow His ways. And so I would come home on fire from those youth camps, and then I would go to our Sunday service as, like a 12, 13-year-old kid. And I just remember sitting in there, and it was so hard for me. You know, it's one of those incredibly beautiful churches, Gothic building that's like 800 years old, and it's a Lutheran church. It's a lot of Lutheran liturgy, and you know, today I studied theology, and I really appreciate liturgy actually, and it speaks to me because I understand what they're saying, and it's accurate and beautiful. But as a 12-year-old kid, I sat in there, and it was like, oh, this is so hard. And then they just used all of those words I didn't understand. And then they suddenly got up, and I didn't really know that I have to get up too. And everything just kind of felt a little bit sad. And I just didn't know what exactly was going on. And so church for me, as you know, somebody who came to church, tried to go to church for the first time, it just felt like it was full of banana peels. It was just so hard. It was inaccessible. And you know, so often that's what church is like for many of us, isn't it? Church is like a community of people that have a shared language that outsiders that usually don't go to church might not understand, or there's a culture about it that's just difficult to get into, or, you know, I believe every church ultimately has those banana peels that make it difficult, or that can make it difficult for people to really set foot in. There's like a banana peel barrier for people who coming into a church and they're seeking community or meaning or God. We are currently in a sermon series called Deeper and Wider. Last week, Chris preached a sermon where he looked at what it means to be a deeper church. And we said that's not just knowing a lot of complicated concepts. It means living a life that's transformed by the love of Jesus. And today we want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a wide church. We don't just want to be deeper, we also want to be wider. I asked AI to create a picture of me with Chris and his favorite activity, which is digging holes when he is out at the beach. And I don't know if you've ever been at the beach and there's like this soft sand and you try to dig a hole. You know, the deeper you get digging that hole, you will notice that the sides always collapse. And the deeper you get, automatically, the wider you get immediately as well. I think that's the same thing in church. The deeper we get into our faith, the wider we will get, the more we will see the need to love our neighbors and the people around us and the people that just haven't experienced this beautiful love of Jesus. So we talk about going deeper, and at the same time, we want to get wider as a church. And when we say we want to get wide as a church, we mean by that we want to be a church that people who usually don't go to church want to be part of. So we always want to ask the question, what are our banana peels that make it hard for people to join this church and to find and follow Jesus here? So maybe you're here for the first time and you don't really know what's happening and you're discovering all of this. This sermon is a little bit for you because you get to know today what we want to be like for you and what type of experience we want to offer for you. And maybe you have been at church for a very long time and you've maybe always been coming here for many, many years, and you often think about bringing a friend to church. But you're wondering about all of those banana peels. Should you really bring your friend here? Because it's slippery, it can be difficult. So we want to ask the question today, and that's a question that we ask ourselves as FBC a lot. Are there obstacles that could be removed for people finding and following Jesus? You know what? And maybe you're here today and you're kind of critical and skeptical of this question because you think we shouldn't make it, easier for people, and we're maybe too concerned with all of that. If that's you, I beg you to wrestle with the text today that we're looking at. because the early church asked that very question in the book of Acts, and we're going to be looking at that today. We're going to be looking at Acts 15, that's the Council of Jerusalem, and we're going to look what that's going to tell us about wanting to be wider. Fascinating text. Loved studying it the last couple weeks, and I'm excited to take you with me. So we're going to discover first that there's a problem in Acts 15, 1 to 6. And the problem is a cultural problem, which is interesting. So certain people came down from Judea to Antioch, and they were teaching the believers. So it's important that we understand locations here a little bit for those of you who aren't the geniuses in geography. So I have a small little map here. We have Israel over here with Judea down here and Jerusalem down here. And Antioch is all the way up here in Syria. And that's significant for many reasons because, Jesus, who our whole Christianity is based upon, he spent almost all of his time in Israel where mostly Jewish people lived. And Jesus was a Jewish man himself. And the Jewish people that lived in Israel during the time of Jesus, they came to be convinced that Jesus is indeed the one that all the Jewish scriptures are pointing towards. He is the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. Okay? So Jesus came and he died in Jerusalem and he was raised back to life in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem became, you could say, the headquarters of the early church. That's where a lot of decisions were made, and where a lot of his early followers were around. But the news about Jesus didn't just spread to all the other Jews in Israel, it spread outside of Israel as well, and that's exactly the situation that we have here. So the extraordinary thing about this passage is that we're learning that suddenly Gentiles, which is just a word of saying non-Jews, are starting to follow the Jewish Messiah. And that's quite extraordinary, and it brings quite a few problems. So there's people now coming to the believers in Antioch, to those who follow Jesus in Antioch, and they say, because they're non-Jews, so they're not circumcised, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Fascinating. So we're going to be talking about circumcision a little bit today. And circumcision is a sign for the Jewish, like an identity marker. If you're circumcised, that means you are part of the Jewish people. It's kind of like when my family, when we go to watch a Stuttgart game, one of the greatest football clubs in the world, we all will put our Stuttgart gear on because we want everybody to recognize that we belong to the right team. And whenever I watch Stuttgart at home, our little puppy, Mr. Darcy, he also gets to wear his Stuttgart jersey because we want to make sure that everybody knows where he belongs to, okay? So what a Stuttgart jersey is to a Stuttgart fan, circumcision is to the believers, to the Jews, yeah? It's the sign that you're one of us. It's the sign that you truly are a Jew yourself. So what those people here saying is, in order to truly follow the Jewish Messiah, they should also become Jews. So the people that aren't Jews to begin with, start following the Jewish Messiah, and in order to do that, they should become Jews. And then we continue reading in our text, and it says, this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debates with them. Who would have thought there was already fighting in the early church, right? That's good to know, huh? So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. So they're now going to Jerusalem, where the headquarters of the early church is, and the church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, that's just on the way to Jerusalem, they told how the Gentiles had been converted, and this news made all believers very glad. And when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. And then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. So no matter if you've been to church for a long time or not, you've probably heard of the Pharisees, because sometimes even in common language we call people Pharisees that are just too much of rule followers, right? So oftentimes the Pharisees, they have a very bad connotation, but I find myself defending them more often than not. Not because I always agree with the Pharisees, but because I find we are oftentimes more like the Pharisees than we think we are. So I want to summarize the argument here that's going on. So we have on the one side the Pharisees. So the question is, what do we do with circumcisions? Do people who aren't Jews have to become Jews first in order to be followers of the Jewish Messiah? And we have the viewpoint of Paul and Barnabas and some of the others, and we have the viewpoint of the Pharisees. And rather than just saying, the Pharisees are wrong anyway, try to be open-minded about this real quick and think about where you might find yourself. So generally, the Apostle Paul would say this. He would say, well, circumcision is not forbidden. He's writing a lot about circumcision and against circumcision because he sees a big danger that it can lead away from grace. So are people who are becoming Jews then just starting to follow the Jewish law rather than the grace that Jesus has brought? That's his big concern in the book of Galatians, for example, which he wrote. But, and this is interesting, Paul advised his follower Timothy to get circumcised. So Paul is not against it in the sense of it cannot be done, but he's just saying there's danger, so let us be super careful about it and let us rather not do it. So that's Paul's standpoint. Here's what the Pharisees say, and I'm phrasing this so that hopefully you might find some sympathy for it. So the Pharisees, they say, no, it's commanded. And why is it commanded? Because they see a big opportunity in it. They say if people have to become Jews in order to follow the Jewish Messiah, that helps them to fully, instruct them about who the Jewish Messiah is. The Jews, they celebrated so many festivals. For example, the Passover festival. Beautiful festival where they remember that Israel was being brought out of Egypt by God and brought into the promised land. And they do it by eating unleavened bread. It reminds them of the fastness of their leaving. And then they're eating bitter herbs. It reminds them of the hardness and the bitterness of having to leave and then being in the desert. And then they eat a Passover lamb. And it reminds them of the salvation that God has brought. Imagine you do that every year. And then you think about Jesus being the Passover lamb. I mean, there's a completely deep and wonderful meaning about the Passover festival if you want to understand the Passover lamb. So Paul sees the danger. The Pharisees, they see the opportunity of, don't take the Jewishness out of Jesus, is what they would probably say. Don't make it just unnecessarily easy for people. Instruct them well and instruct them deeply. That's what the Jews say. I'm not just to take the tension out of the room. I'm not going to argue for circumcision today. I just want to make you a little sympathetic to the viewpoint of the Pharisees here. To me, it's not so clear which one should win. It is now, but I can understand why it wasn't so clear. And it really wasn't super clear to the early church, and we see that here. So the early church comes together, and this is the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, verse 6. And it's interesting because it says, and the apostles and elders, they met to consider this question. So they thought it's necessary to, bring all the important people together and debate and discuss about it. And so they did. So it wasn't like, no, clearly this is bad. It's, no, we need to come together and talk about it. So they end up with a church council. That might be an original picture from back then when they did it in Acts 15. So they're having their church council, they're debating this question, and at the end of their council, I find this super fascinating, they say, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us, and then they came to a conclusion. First of all, interesting that they come to a conclusion in a church council, that's good. Second of all, I find it interesting that through the church council, they came to a conclusion. And they say the Holy Spirit has spoken. You know what? Sometimes the Holy Spirit can even speak in church meetings. I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? It's not like the mysterious ways of the Spirit. No, we sit together, get a flip chart out, and we fight and discuss, and at the end we say, no, we came to a conclusion, the Holy Spirit has spoken. Fascinating how they come to that. Okay, so then I'm just going to summarize you. So now we have 3 statements of people that talk about why they think, what they think on the matter. And I'm just going to summarize these statements very briefly for you. So Peter gets up and he gives a statement. He says, hey, God has given the Gentiles life-changing faith, verse 7 to 11. And then the Apostle Paul gets up and he says, hey, God is working among the Gentiles. We have to see it. And then James, the half-brother of Jesus, he gets up and says, well, but God said the Gentiles would be included in his work, verses 13 and 18. You can read those and study those at home. I'm not going to go into the details of those because it's interesting. One of the commentaries that I was reading on the Bible text, he said, yeah, these are all great statements and they're helpful and stuff, but they don't at all deal with the issue of circumcision, which is like, okay, so great. Now everybody has preached their sermon. Everybody kind of missed the topic a little bit. And so now what do we do on the topic of circumcision? We know now that God is at work in the Gentiles and that he said they would be included, but might it still be better for them, more instructive for them to be circumcised? That question hasn't been answered yet. So the question that has been answered is, God is evidently at work in the Gentiles, just as he said he would be. And we are coming now to the conclusion of the meeting. And this conclusion is so interesting. So the question is, should Gentiles, non-Jews, become Jews and be circumcised in order for extra instruction? The answer, I'm just going to give that to you before I go to the verse. The answer is, no, they don't have to. And you might be glad about that, and you already expected that answer, because next week we have a baptism Sunday and not a circumcision Sunday. So we kind of know just because of how churches run, right? So, but the interesting thing is, in this meeting, in this council, circumcision is not rejected because it's not helpful or because it's inherently sinful or because it's necessarily super bad in any means. I'll tell you why it has been rejected and why we don't circumcise people today. And this, I find this just so interesting. It says, it is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. It's the only real line of argument against circumcision in this text. Hey, let's not make it difficult. Let's not throw banana peels. And I find it so interesting, the word that's being used here. It's a Greek word, parenochleo. And parenochleo just is here translated with let's not make it difficult, which is a correct translation, of course. But it's interesting when we see the word, it's being put together from 2 Greek words. It's para and enochleo. And enochleo just means to trouble, to make it difficult, to not burden somebody, to not throw banana peels, essentially. That's what enochleo means. And then, fascinatingly enough, there's this para in front of it, so it's a compound word. And para just means alongside something else or in addition to. So one of the Bible commentaries that comments on this word, a lexicon and concordance, it translates paranochleo with we should not disturb them alongside something else, or we should not trouble them besides. So the early church seemed to have understood that following Jesus already is difficult. It's already difficult to follow Jesus. And following Jesus means following his way, doesn't it? Following the life like he lived it, and we want to live it in a similar way. And, you think about the life of Jesus, and, he said about himself, the Son of Man, which he called himself sometimes, he said he had no place to lay his head. Jesus was pursued and persecuted. He was tortured and killed. He had nothing, and he gave everything. And we are called to follow in his way. That's not easy. You know, in the early church, they understood that incredibly well. If you read the book of Acts, where the early church history is recorded as Acts 15 here, you'll read in Acts 5 how Peter and John, some of the followers of Jesus, they were arrested and beaten by the Jewish court because they believed in Jesus. Another follower of Jesus, Stephen, he was arrested and on trial and stoned. You know, do you think as his lifeless body was laying there on the floor, people would have come up to him and be like, oh my gosh, it's so good to follow Jesus. He just gives me everything that I need and so much prosperity and health, and it's always good, and following Jesus is we oftentimes become like advertisement agents for Jesus, which we are and we are supposed to be, but not in a way that says, hey, following Jesus is the easiest thing ever, because it is not easy. Acts 8 verse 1, it says, on that day, great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. You know, we as his disciples, the early church, but also us, we are called to, what does Jesus say? For everyone, take up their cross daily and follow me. That's not an easy call. You know, I think about one of my friends that I got to meet in Germany. He's originally from Iran, and he came to believe in Jesus while growing up in a Muslim family. And his mom is actually an Islam teacher. And when he became a Christian, he was rejected and abandoned by his whole family, threats on his life. So he had to run away, and he came to Germany and happened to become part of our church. And I'm so glad I got to meet him. That's what it's sometimes like. Following Jesus and taking up your cross. And that's not all of our faith, right? Not all of us will face like crazy persecution and death threats and all those type of things. But all of us are commanded to follow in the way of Jesus. And that's hard, because that means, for example, loving your enemies when it's way easier to hate them. It means standing up for the oppressed. It means that when somebody's bullied in your workplace, you step in, even if that ruins all of your social status in the company. It means praying for those who hurt you, physically or emotionally. Like, I don't want to pray for them, right? But that's what we're asked to do. It means saying no to some aspects of luxury in order to bless the poor and the weak. It means serving inside or outside of the church when you could also be on your comfortable sofa. It means forgiving those who've hurt you when it's so much easier to just hold a grudge. You know, following Jesus is anything, but it's not easy. And what the early church here said is, hey, let's not trouble them. Let's not add unnecessary difficulties on top of how hard it already is to follow in the ways of Jesus. So parenochleo implies that finding and following Jesus is already difficult. You know, I'd like to think of it, following Jesus is like walking on a small, stony path somewhere in the beautiful Alps. It's hard and it's dangerous, and you know, you might trip and fall, and you might even hurt yourself. Occasionally you will stop and just see the amazing view and realize how good it is to live in God's grace. But then you realize again there's hardship. You know, imagine you go to the Alps and you go hiking up there, and the hiking path suddenly looks like that. Like, that's making it unnecessarily hard, isn't it? So this text, I'm going to wrap this up now. This text is saying following Jesus is hard enough. Let's not make it unnecessarily harder. So that's one of the things that's just very important for us as a church. We always say we want to remove all the unnecessary obstacles, all the banana peels from people finding and following Jesus. And it's something that we're always wrestling with as a church. How can we do that? What are banana peels that we still make it unnecessarily difficult for people? You see, the thing is, the drift of every church is just to serve the insiders of the church. Because the insiders are here, right? You have a voice. You can tell the pastor afterwards what you'd like and which songs you like. The people who usually don't come to church, they can't stand up for themselves. So we need to make it a routine as a church, and we have been for many years, to ask, hey, what are unnecessary banana peels that are just in the way of people finding and following Jesus? So we try to be, especially on a Sunday morning, accessible and not too demanding. It should be a doable first step. We try to be welcoming and not cliquey. You know, how amazing would it be if not just the welcoming team in our church is doing the welcoming, but everybody? That's removing a banana peel too, isn't it? We want to offer clarity and confusion. Where do I need to be? What do I need to do? We want to be open and judgmental, see everything, every question, not as a threat, but as an opportunity to learn together. So that's a tendency we want to fight for. Always think about what are unnecessarily obstacles in the way of people finding and following Jesus. And we don't want to make it unnecessarily difficult. This has been a challenge for me as I was preparing this sermon in the last few weeks, where I asked myself the question too, Tim, where are you, not just as a pastor and we as a church, but where in your personal life are you throwing banana peels? You know, where are you making it harder for people to find and follow Jesus? And, I've been able to identify some things in my life where I'm doing that, and I hope that I get to work at that. The question is maybe something for you as well. So I want to encourage you, next time you eat a banana, you open the banana and take the banana peel and hopefully you throw it into your biocompostables. Think about, at this day when you're eating this banana, what might have been banana peels that you put in the way of people finding and following Jesus? I can't answer that question for you, but maybe that's an encouragement every single time you eat a banana to ask that question. The band can come up as I wrap up. You know, I was at Cape Ray Bible School, a Bible school student up in the north of England here. And one of the things that I loved is it's this beautiful old manor house, castle-like thing. And it's always been so well taken care of. And they have a whole landscaping crew that's taking care of it. And it's just this gorgeous place. And I remember last time I was there was a moment that I'll just never forget, because one of the, so Mark Thomas, he's one of the guys who his dad bought the school and started essentially an imperium of a whole empire of Bible schools all over the world. And so Mark is kind of like a big name, you know, in the world of those of Torchborough Bible schools. And he still comes to teach, and he's now retired. He's an older gentleman, and I just remember he was teaching, and you know, after you teach, you're usually tired. And he was just walking to the dining room, and he was walking around, and then suddenly a little bit of plastic, just the wind was blowing it across his path, and this, 75-year-old Mark, he knelt down on one knee, and he just picked up the plastic, and he took it and put it in his pant pocket. And I thought, that helps me to understand why Cape Ray is such a pristine and beautiful and clean place. And it was also an encouragement for me to be like that. What could it be like if I and you, if we would start just like collecting banana peels here in this church and in our private life, really try to be aware of the type of language that we use and the type of things that we do and how we are and how we act, and just remove all of the unnecessary banana peels. That's what I want to do in my life. That's what I want to be like. And I hope you too. Let me pray. Jesus, I pray that you would just reveal where we put unnecessary obstacles in the way of people meeting you. I pray that you would make us aware of our language and of our actions and of the way we love or not love or just whatever needs to be done, Jesus. Jesus, I pray that you would all give us such a deep desire to be wide, to see the needs of other people, and just to do whatever is necessary for them to come in contact with your amazing grace. Thank you, Jesus, for this passage, and may you challenge us by it.